program titled The Biden Administration Evolving Landscape, OSHA and CDC COVID-19 Guidance. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. For those of you who are logged into the web presentation, you are encouraged to submit questions throughout the conference by typing them into the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen. For those interested in obtaining CLE credit for this webinar, an attendance verification code will be read during the presentation that will be required on the CLE attendance affirmation form. Please write this code down as it will not be reread and is required for CLE credit. Copies of the webinar recording and materials along with the CLE attendance form will be distributed to attendees in the days following the webinar. On the next slide, you will see a legal disclaimer. At this time, I would like to turn it over to our first speaker for today's program, Scott Hecker. Scott, please go ahead.
Thanks, Kate. Good morning or good afternoon to everyone, depending where you're joining us from. Joining me today, I'm a senior counsel in our DC office. With me, I have Patrick Joyce, an associate recently transferred to Seattle, and Adam Young, a partner in Chicago. So as you'll see, we have a coast-to-coast representation, which is true of our workplace safety group as a whole, including coverage in California, where there's the always interesting and sometimes peculiar Cal OSHA to deal with. But moving ahead to our agenda, Kate. And today we'll be speaking about the COVID-19 ETS that's been pending review for quite some time now, give a status update on that. I'll speak to that, and then Adam will take over and talk about recent CDC guidance and workplace impacts, and Patrick will bring it home with a discussion of OSHA enforcement. So moving to the next slide, and actually we can skip to the next substantive slide. So just a quick sort of update on where we stand with vaccination. There have been over 285 million doses administered. As we all recall, President Biden set a goal to administer over 200 million doses in his first 100 days and cleared that. At this point, we have a large number of the US population 18 and older receiving one dose, even larger, 65 and older, over 85% at this point. We are seeing that the downward trend in the 7-day rolling average. In part, that's probably because a lot of folks who were chomping at the bit to get the vaccination right away have now done that, and the administration is needing to shift strategies to sort of reach out to folks who are thinking they'll get it when it's convenient, or they may still be on the fence about whether to get the vaccination at all. But given that the sort of numbers that we've seen and that President Biden saw in his first 100 days, he did shift strategy a bit as well to say the goal now is to have 70% of adult Americans receive at least one dose by July 4th. And right now that number is I think around approaching 50%. So we did see a single day high of over 4 million doses. That was back on April 1st. But again, now we're seeing a little bit more of a downward trend. However, 2 weeks ago, the FDA expanded the scope of Pfizer's emergency use authorization. So that vaccine is now being administered to 12 and up, ages 12 and up, meaning that the age range has increased. And so hopefully we'll see that expand as well. If we could go to the next slide, Kate. So we mentioned the ETS a minute ago, and it's been an interesting ride. On President Biden's first day in office, he issued an executive order directing OSHA to consider whether an ETS, an emergency temporary standard, was necessary, and if so, to issue one by March 15th. For those of you with calendars, you know that was more than 2 months ago now. And it's actually been about a month since OSHA kind of signaled that there was a move forward and that at least a delayed issuance would happen, as on April 26th, the evening of April 26th, OSHA kicked the ETS over to the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs with the White House for review to finalize and issue the ETS. However, beginning on the 28th, OIRA began scheduling what are known as 12-866 meetings that are stakeholder meetings so that OIRA could hear and consider comments from stakeholders, interested entities on the ETS. Because it's an emergency standard, there's no notice and comment period, but this is one way that OIRA listens to interested parties. And they scheduled over 40 of those. And in fact, we thought the pace of scheduling was sort of slowing down, and it looked like that they might wrap up today. But if you look at OIRA's website each morning, like we do, you know that there's now one scheduled for Wednesday, which again that'll mark a full month since this emergency standard was sent over to the White House. You know, the longer it takes to issue an ETS, the less sense it makes, at least from our perspective. Section 6C of the Occupational Safety and Health Act requires that employees are exposed to grave danger from exposure to substances or agents determined to be toxic or physically harmful, or from new hazards, and that such emergency standard is necessary to protect employees from danger. So the grave danger and the necessary pieces are a bit more difficult the longer we go out here. And as, again, vaccinations increase and the administration begins to talk about sort of turning the corner, it may be a little bit more difficult to demonstrate those issues, the danger and necessity pieces. You know, unions and worker advocates have sort of hoped and been pushing for an ETS for a long time and still continue to do so. They've, I think, been hopeful that some of the pieces of the Cal OSHA ETS out in California may be incorporated, such as the maintaining benefits and worker pay for employees who are out when they're diagnosed as infected. And in fact, Doug Parker, who is the current Cal OSHA chief, is the nominee for Assistant Secretary for Federal OSHA. But note that the Cal OSHA Standards Board has proposed some changes to that standard, which they were initially supposed to vote on last Thursday, May 20th. But the board has now extended consideration based on recent CDC guidance that Adam will talk to you about soon, and now plans to vote on that next Friday. So now in California, that ETS that was issued back in December is still governing law and has not been revised yet, but keep an eye out for those updates. Again, there's some federalism aspects here that I won't bore you too much with, but if you're a state plan state and OSHA issues an ETS, your state plan needs to then issue one within 30 days that is at least as effective as OSHA's. Folks that follow federal OSHA generally obviously will need to, be able to comply with the OSHA ETS. And then we have a state like New York that actually is just a state plan state for public employees, but it has just issued the HERO Act and was signed into law by Governor Cuomo. That's meant to protect workers from aerosol transmissible diseases. So there may be some issues there about preemption. If the ETS issues, we do expect that there'll be challenges from states and from associations like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. The Congressional Research Service has a report on the success of those challenges. OSHA's issued, 9 ETSs, and the courts have vacated, fully vacated or stayed in 4 of those and partially vacated in 1. So it's sort of a mixed bag as to whether these make it through. Historically, OSHA hasn't mandated, and we heard the CDC director, Rochelle Walensky, say that any mandate of vaccinations would come from state or local level, not federal. But we can anticipate that, OSHA will, if they issue the ETS, some of the things that might be in there would be, in addition to state ETS provisions like California's that we mentioned, CDC guidance you would think would be incorporated, and they wouldn't want to conflict here. But also OSHA's guidance that's still up on the website from January 29th about, all the things that should go in the most effective of OSHA response plans. So it'll be an interesting time to see whether OSHA actually kicks this out or whether we're going to be sort of in a situation where we remain in limbo. But for the moment, I'm going to give it over to Adam so he can talk about CDC guidance and the impacts there and what we can expect in the meantime while OIRA continues to review the OSHA ETS.
Well, thank you, Scott. We're all interested in seeing how that ETS plays out and how that saga continues. If we go on to the next slide, I want to give everyone a background, just a reminder, since last year, the CDC has recommended a range of precautions and protocols to prevent workplace COVID-19 transmission. And as we return to normal, we need to keep in mind that many of those CDC recommendations are still operational. They're still out there for all employees and workplaces, and that would include vaccinated and unvaccinated employees. And our general guidance has always been that through compliance with CDC guidance, employers can limit liability in most legal contexts. And of course, complying with state and local rules is important as well. If we want to go on to the next slide, the CDC has revised its guidance with regard to fully vaccinated individuals. It's been in the news for the last few weeks. Those vaccinated individuals do not need a mask or social distance for outdoor or indoor activities in most settings, with some limited exceptions, such as correctional institutions and homeless shelters and transportation activities. The OSHA, we expected them to follow suit, and shortly after, they did incorporate that guidance by reference with the quote that's provided on the bottom of the page here. They say, the quote says to refer to the CDC on how to protect your fully vaccinated employees, even though they had prior guidance out there that said you have to treat everyone the same. The new guidance seems to confer that employers can reduce mask and social distance recommendations and policies for those vaccinated employees. If we want to go on to the next page, many employers have revised their policies or are in the process of doing so based on that CDC guidance. And we've been guiding employers out there and happy to help everyone on the line. I want to briefly talk about the risks of different options that we're seeing employers take. One is, retaining current precautions. It's not primarily a legal liability or liability issue to do so. And we have heard from a lot of employers out there that employees, want to remove masks, particularly in the summer and in hot environments. So there may be more of an employee relations issue for folks going with option one and keeping the status quo. Also, the impetus for the CDC's guidance was that it's desirable for employees not to mask or distance, so it would encourage them to vaccinate. So if you don't change your policy, is that quantifiably going to create less individuals who get vaccinated? I think that's a little bit unclear at this point. Options 2 and 3, which would be revising your masking and distancing policies for vaccinated employees or eliminating additional precautions beyond that. There are forms of enhanced liability associated with each of those, and we'll talk about those. Option 3 is going beyond what is permitted by the CDC guidance. So there's going to be the highest levels of elevated liability to the extent that you choose that option. If we want to go on to the next slide, the different areas of liability that we're going to see are outlined here in 1 through 5. First, state and local rules and guidance is an important one. Many states and local jurisdictions have masking and social distancing requirements, some of which explicitly apply to all employees or all employees when they're indoors. States and local jurisdictions were caught by surprise by the May 14th CDC update. And while those guidances and rules are changing rapidly, there still may be situations where individuals are required to comply at a state and local level, even though they could change their policies based on CDC guidance. And we track every jurisdiction in the United States in our L&E group for these issues. So if you need advice on any jurisdiction, reach out to us and we can help you there. Next one, number 2, throughout the pandemic, we've seen huge increases in the number of employee complaints and customer complaints, third-party complaints about COVID-19 precautions and protocols. And the reason why is people are anxious. It's very concerning with a pandemic going on. If you do change your policies, you have more people who are unmasked within 6 feet, you're going to likely see some anxiety caused by that and some internal complaints to OSHA, or complaints to a state agency. And even if those complaints don't result in citations, they could result in inspections, time-consuming information requests, workplace disruptions. And anytime OSHA is going to be doing an inspection, it could expand to other areas. So it's concerning in that respect. In terms of workers' compensation, there could be increased numbers of workers' comp claims filed based on alleged COVID-19 transmissions at work, where there are workers' comp presumptions. If you depart from the CDC guidance with the option 3, you may be losing that safe harbor of being able to rebut a workers' comp presumption. With regard to OSHA liability, the 5th thing, outlined here. Even if federal OSHA were to conduct an inspection and considering issuing a citation based on vaccinated employees being unmasked and not distanced, we think it's unlikely that they would issue citations in that respect. Considering the new guidance, considering that the CDC says this is relatively safe, it would undercut OSHA's ability to prove employee exposure to a hazard. And there'd also be a due process issue considering the kind of vague adoption of the CDC's guidance that they put out there. With regard to option 3, what I talked about before is, dropping all your COVID precautions and protocols, or allowing everyone unmasked and not distanced. That would likely create more OSHA liability because you'd have unvaccinated employees who are in the workplace, they're not socially distanced, having close contacts with others. That may be a recognized hazard of COVID-19 transmission if OSHA could prove it, though still very difficult to do so. And that may be more likely to result in OSHA liability in terms of citations or hazard alert letters that employers need to look into more. In terms of any option that you take, there are 3 key mitigation tools, even if you change masking and distancing recommendations. The first is vaccine verification. This is verifying that employees have received a COVID vaccine. Our clients, we've been talking about all last week, are doing this 100 different ways, from an unspoken honor system, required scanning of cards. People are considering all those different options and how best to do that and verify if people have vaccines. That will probably be one of the best ways to ensure that there is not COVID-19 transmission in a workplace if everyone there is vaccinated. So that's one helpful way to address mitigation of risks. And next is continuing wellness screenings. That eliminates the symptomatic, or helps eliminate the symptomatic employees from the work site. Some clients are doing this different ways. They're having employees do it themselves at home before work. Others are continuing with workplace screenings and forms or apps that they've used for this purpose. And that's a second main way to keep symptomatic and contagious employees out of the work site, so very important there. And the third is visitor control. So if you have other third parties coming onto the work site who may be unvaccinated, that may be a source of COVID-19 transmission. So to the extent you have visitor policies, or you're confirming the status or confirming that those individuals comply with masking and distancing recommendations based on, if they are unvaccinated, that's a third important way to ensure that COVID-19 transmission isn't going on at your work site. So here's the areas of liability. Here's some of the mitigation tools clients are using to help minimize the legal risk going forward. If we want to go on to the next slide, I'll turn things over to Patrick to talk about OSHA enforcement in more detail. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Adam. Really appreciate it. And I just want to build off of one thing that Adam said in terms of vaccine verifications. Oregon OSHA and Oregon Health Authority came out with some guidance and requirements last week that are probably going to be the most stringent in this area, where to allow employees or customers at a retail store, people coming into the office, to be able to go maskless, they're actually saying that the employer has to verify proof of vaccination, and it's not a certification or an attestation that's maybe been the case in some locations. Oregon OSHA is taking the position that they actually have to see the vaccine card itself or some other type of proof of vaccination issued by some government agency. So that's definitely one extreme. So before I jump into mine, I'm going to read off the CLE code. It is SS as in Seyfarth Shaw. So it's SS 3728. Again, SS 3728. And Kate, if you go to the next slide. So I'm seeing a lot of questions come in on the Q&A here. So I'm going to try and cut mine a little bit shorter than I would have, so that we can at least get some questions answered as people are putting them over in the Q&A area. Just a current state of OSHA enforcement when it comes to COVID-19. As of early May, I think it was like May 5th, an OSHA spokesperson said that there were 66,101 COVID-related complaints that OSHA had investigated, and that's just federal OSHA. So keep in mind, there's a lot of state plans that have done a similar number proportionally. Of those complaints, and that's since February 1st of 2020, of those complaints, as of mid-April, and I haven't seen more recent numbers, I'm sure they're out there, but 426 actual COVID inspections resulting in just over $5 million in penalties. A lot of that has been focused on healthcare and some of the other industries that you've been hearing about in the news. So to kind of change that and move that along, OSHA put out in March its National Emphasis Program for COVID-19, which was effective, quote, immediately. And really the goal, the stated goal of OSHA was to make sure that the employees in those high hazard industries were protected from COVID-19. And I'll show a list very briefly in the next couple of slides of target industries. But really it's like I said, healthcare, meat processing, grocery stores. So a lot of the areas where there have been some COVID infections has been in grocery stores because they've remained open as essential businesses, and there's a lot of interaction with customers. And then warehousing, storage, and restaurants, and then as Adam previously mentioned, correctional institutions. OSHA also made it a goal of the NEP to really push back on any sort of retaliation against employees who may have expressed concerns as to COVID in the workplace and what particular mitigation measures are being put in place or perhaps not put in place by their employers. One of the things that kind of going with this theme of vaccination that Scott started off with, a lot of the high hazard industries that OSHA is targeting with this NEP are some of those that are the highest numbers of vaccinations. Healthcare, it has an extremely high percentage of vaccination amongst its employees. It was the first industry really to get full access to the vaccines. Of course, we understand why. But so the disconnect, it's kind of going in a circular motion round and round with, well, we're focusing on these industries, but actually these industries, healthcare, et cetera, may be some of the more protected industries when it comes to, COVID transmission in the workplace. Next slide, please, Kate. So this is a list of target industries that are listed specifically on the NEP. There's kind of three buckets. So healthcare, like I said, being one of them, non-healthcare, that this is the list that OSHA put out. And then there's kind of a catch-all, which they call high hazard industries. And Kate, if you go to the next slide, these are some secondary target industries. I'm sure many of you are in these industries. So as Adam said, we deal with this day in, day out, and please feel free at the beginning of the webinar, you had our emails and phone numbers, but you can also find us on the website. Please feel free to reach out about this. Next slide, please, Kate. So along with the NEP, OSHA put out what they call an Interim Enforcement Response Plan. And what that really does is provide the area offices and the compliance officers some steps to follow or some guidelines for when they're actually conducting these inspections or for scheduling the inspections. So along with the NEP, there was a focus from OSHA on doing more on-site inspections because previously during the pandemic, they had essentially stopped on-site inspections except in very limited circumstances. And there's going to be a priority or has been a priority in complaints or injury accident notifications where death or hospitalizations from COVID with occupational exposure has been the cause. So the goal of the NEP and the IERP was to have 5% of each area office's inspections be COVID related on-site inspections or mostly on-site. So that would be about 1,600. Given that number that I gave you before, 66,000 complaints and 426 inspections, that's under 1%. So they're not quite there yet. Maybe they're going to start ramping it up. But practically speaking, we haven't seen a lot of on-site OSHA inspections with respect to COVID-19 specifically. They may be on site for another reason and ask COVID-related questions or something like that, but OSHA has not opened a lot of dedicated COVID inspections, except in some of those higher hazard industries, in areas where there's really high transmission, or you have multiple proven workplace occupational exposure situations, and OSHA can prove that. When it comes to, so there's been a lot of questions, getting back again to vaccination, there have been a lot of questions about, from a record keeping perspective, if an employee has an adverse reaction to a vaccine, whether that should be recorded on the employer's OSHA 300 log. And OSHA just this weekend, or late last week, updated their FAQs with respect to record keeping, and specifically said that employers don't need to record adverse vaccine reactions on the OSHA 300 log. So I think that's a pretty big boon for employers. And one of the reasons that OSHA presented was that they want to encourage vaccinations rather than discourage vaccinations. And one of the ways to do that is to have the employers actually take on the role of encouraging their employees to get vaccinated. So it seems like that's going to be, hopefully, will help employers push the, getting their employees vaccinated. And I know that was kind of quick, but given all the Q&As that we've seen, I wanted to get some of those. And Scott, one of the first ones that I saw, I'm going to kick back to you if you don't mind, and I'm going to skip this slide so we can send out the slide materials later. Scott, one of the first ones I saw, which I thought was a great question with respect to OIRA. Who are the stakeholders that have been involved in terms of the meetings?
Sure. So you can actually find this information on OIRA's website. If you Google OIRA 12866 meetings, you'll get the right link. But basically, you can submit requests to meet with OIRA, and typically, you might see trade associations, unions, potentially individuals to go in and just meet and share concerns. Again, it's a little bit of flying blind because the stakeholders don't have the reg text. They don't have what this ETS is going to read. So they're going in just suggesting ideas or saying, here's what we think might be in here. We have some concerns. Please think about what this will do to small businesses or how this will impact employers in various ways. So it's really just anyone who's interested in stakeholding, but you do tend to see, industry associations or unions there. And it'll be folks from OIRA. OSHA will likely have representatives there. Probably OSHA's attorneys will be there. And you do have people from the Small Business Administration as well participate in these, the SBA. So those are some of the folks that you can expect would be involved, again, in 40 plus meetings that they've scheduled on this thing. So.
Kate, you can go back to the, oh, go ahead, Scott.
I was just going to say, looking at sort of what else is up next, but if you had further thoughts on that, Patrick.
No, I didn't. I was just going to ask Kate to go back to the slide with our contact information on it, and just kind of leave that one up so people can get it down. Scott, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just looking at some of these other questions here, and we have, I think, a minute or so, but I believe we're all willing to stick around and try and answer some of these if folks can stay on the line and want to hear some of these responses. But Adam, I was wondering, and not to put you on the spot, but if you had any thoughts on the issue of whether private companies can continue to institute risk mitigation protocols if, for example, California opens this up and gets rid of social distancing, mask, capacity requirements. What can private employers do in that space?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Scott. I saw the question, can employers continue social distancing, mask, and capacity requirements? And I think the answer to that is yes, you absolutely can. Well, one of the risks is mostly going to be employee relations, right? That people might be upset that they have to continue wearing a mask. Can you allow employees who are vaccinated to not wear masks and require unvaccinated employees to wear masks? And the answer to that is also yes. Unless state or local rules require everyone to wear a mask, you can require people who are unvaccinated to wear masks. And that's being done in the employee context and in the customer, customer and visitor context as well. When do you want to talk about proof, asking for proof on vaccination and our thoughts on that?
Sure, I'm happy to jump in on that one since we're kind of ping-ponging along here. So yeah, I saw several questions related to whether it's permissible for employers to ask for proof of vaccination, or even ask the question about, not even to see proof, but just ask the question as to whether an employee is vaccinated. And yes, EEOC, and this could be a topic for a whole other webinar, and we were actually talking about that beforehand, maybe encouraging some of our employment and colleagues to do a webinar on this. But generally speaking, EEOC has said that yes, it is permissible to ask an employee, and not a violation of any privacy laws or ADA, to ask an employee if they have been vaccinated, yes or no question, and to see proof, to ask for further proof of the vaccination. Where you get into a sticky situation and you don't want to go any further is, a situation where an employer might start asking questions about why an employee hasn't been vaccinated or why they don't have proof or something like that. You don't want to go there. EOC has said, don't go any further than just the yes, no question. Have you been vaccinated? And, can I see your vaccine card? Can I see, maybe have you sign like I mentioned before, sign a certification or attestation that you've been vaccinated. Adam,
Yeah,
I'm going to
Patrick,
kick
just
it
on
back.
that.
Oh, go ahead,
Sorry,
Scott.
I just wanted to follow up with you on that. EEOC has, as you said, sort of cautioned against getting beyond that sort of initial ask, right? And I know some folks are concerned with HIPAA, but HIPAA actually only applies to certain sort of health-related entities. So typically, you're not going to run up against that here, and it's also more about sharing information than asking for information. So it shouldn't run afoul of those issues. There are other employment, Adam alluded to sort of morale, thinking about other, concerns, but in general, yeah, asking about it is okay, but be sure, of course, to follow your standard accommodations processes for religious or disability inquiries on that front.
Right. One tip I'd add, a practical tip, if you are collecting information, well, first, you got to keep it private, but second, it may be helpful to know when individuals were vaccinated, because at least what we're hearing from Stanley Fauci is that down the line, there may be boosters that are required or second vaccine doses. So knowing when your employees were vaccinated may be helpful to know who's going to have to wear a mask a year from now, because they haven't been updated with that booster. But it's an unknown as to how that will go out. One of the questions was, is federal OSHA likely to provide guidance on vaccinations and on vaccine verification? Do you have thoughts on that?
I think, their current guidance that we talked about from January does speak about, I think, encouraging vaccination. OSHA has never mandated vaccination. Whether they jump into the space about whether you should collect that, it gets into the record keeping issues to some degree, and I would expect further guidance on how, what that would be. You just talked about keeping it confidential, but is it going to fall under like a medical record that OSHA requires you to keep for like 30 years, or is it going to be sort of something different? Patrick's shaking his head because he loves that provision. But yeah, I think it's interesting. Again, the CDC director said we're not going to get a mandate. What guidance other than sort of encouraging vaccination we'll see, I think is probably up in the air. But OSHA does require offering the hepatitis B vaccine under certain circumstances under its bloodborne pathogen standard, but that's really the closest it's gotten to requiring vaccination. But it does allow employers. It has come out with an opinion letter and other guidance that allows employers to vaccinate. And I think, as we've said, it's allowable to ask for proof of vaccination. So presumably that won't run afoul of OSHA, but there may be additional sort of hurdles, record-keeping hurdles we'll need to jump through.
And I'd plug our Seyfarth colleagues are putting on a vaccine mandates and proof of vaccination webinar tomorrow at 9 Eastern as well. So if you don't have a webinar invite for that, email one of us and we'd be happy to shoot that over to you.
Okay. Do you guys want to keep answering questions? I've got time if people, it seems like people are still on or dropping off, but one further thing I wanted to point out going back to the CDC guidance is that several of the states still have emergency temporary standards in place, and Adam mentioned this. So there may be a discourse or a conflict between what the state, what the governor, maybe an executive order, or the state health department says in terms of adopting the CDC guidance regarding fully vaccinated individuals, no masks, no distancing, etc. But what the actual ETS says, which may not take that into account, because Virginia, Michigan, California, when these were drafted, Oregon, when these ETSs or permanent infectious disease standards were drafted in these state plans, they didn't take this into account. They didn't say, okay, we refer to CDC. Some of them do say, like Virginia, say, if you're following CDC guidance, that's, good faith and will be taken into account. So keep that in mind, even though a state governor or a state executive may say, we're adopting the CDC guidance, there may be a different standard from an employee standpoint with respect to masks and social distancing.
Thanks for that, Patrick.
Yep. Anything else you guys want to add?
I think we've covered a fair number of these. I know we saw a few about whether you can ask for vaccination or vaccination status, how you can approach masking. I think Adam covered, and the HIPAA question or the medical information question. So I think we've covered a lot of broad categories here. Of course, feel free, as both Adam and Patrick have said, to reach out to any one of us with additional questions, and we can answer those offline. But for now, I think we plan to wrap up. And again, our smiling faces and email addresses and phone numbers are all right there. So please reach out, and thank you for your interest in our webinar, and everybody stay safe.
Thank you. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thanks a lot.